When Norman Ohler stepped into the Joe Rogan Experience studio, listeners anticipated a deep dive into his best-selling book, Blitzed: Drugs in Nazi Germany. They didn't see it coming when Ohler leaned forward and dropped a bombshell that stopped Joe in his tracks. "I'm not convinced we've heard the whole story about Hitler's death," he said. This wasn't some fringe internet theory. Ohler's claim was grounded in declassified documents, conflicting eyewitness accounts, untapped Cold War archives. He wasn't chasing headlines or pushing a wild narrative. Ohler was questioning the history we've all accepted. So, what did he uncover? And why are historians suddenly paying attention? Let's start with the moment that flipped the script, because that's where the real mystery kicks off. When Norman Ohler sat across from Joe Rogan, the plan was to unpack Nazi Germany's dark secrets, particularly those in Blitzed, which exposed the Third Reich's heavy reliance on drugs. Ohler describes a grim reality under Hitler's regime, where methamphetamine, specifically Pervitin, was a staple. He notes that 35 million tablets were ordered for the 1940 Western campaign, a staggering number. But less so when you consider the 2.4 million troops involved, averaging about 15 tablets per soldier for the entire operation. Ohler goes beyond the military, arguing that Pervitin was as common as bread in civilian life before the war. He also details Hitler's own drug regimen under his physician Theodor Morell, who fed him Pervitin and Eucadol, a morphine derivative. These drugs, Ohler claims, fueled Hitler's delusions, brushing off defeats in the war's final years as irrelevant, hardening his refusal to compromise. Generals urging tactical retreats were sacked by a man high on artificial euphoria. "Why, I doubt he took his own life when the Allies closed in," Ohler said with a casual shrug. He was too euphoric to make that call. The comment landed like a grenade. Joe's eyebrows shot up. Hold on, there are people who think Hitler didn't die in the bunker. That moment shifted the room's energy. Norman Ohler isn't some clickbait YouTuber or a conspiracy peddler. He's a seasoned investigative journalist who spent years sifting through archives in Germany and Russia. His work thrives on unearthing truths hidden beneath official narratives backed by documents, not Reddit threads. When someone like him suggests the story of Hitler's death might not add up, ears perk up. Joe's did. The studio fell silent. For a moment, a rarity on JRE, Ohler clarified, "I'm not saying Hitler definitely escaped. I'm saying we might have closed the case too fast." He highlighted sealed post-war records, conflicting Soviet and Allied intelligence, and the reliance on testimonies from Hitler's loyalists or those under intense pressure. Ohler wasn't rewriting history. He was cracking it open. "History is written by survivors," he told Joe, "but what survives isn't always the truth. It's what's convenient." Joe leaned in, hooked. This wasn't a wild tangent. It was calculated, precise, and hit harder for it. Ohler wasn't selling a theory, he was posing a question. Why no independent autopsy? Why did Soviet reports on Hitler's deaths shift over time? Why were leaders like Eisenhower and Stalin hesitant to confirm Hitler died in the bunker? History, Ohler argued, isn't built on certainties, but on fragmented stories shaped by fear, politics, or the need to move on. The takeaway wasn't that Hitler survived, it was that people like Ohler, with access to classified files and fading testimonies, are asking questions once deemed untouchable. Joe summed it up in a line that became clickbait gold. It's time to tell everything. That wasn't about stirring drama. It was about curiosity, about the duty to dig deeper, even when the world thinks the story's done. Because if a respected historian questions the most definitive ending of the 20th century, you start wondering, what else did we miss? The official narrative is clean and final on April 30th, 1945. As Soviet forces tightened the noose around Berlin, Adolf Hitler swallowed cyanide and shot himself in the forebunker. Eva Braun, his longtime partner, followed suit. Loyal aides burned their bodies in the garden above, burying the ashes. And just like that, the 20th century's most notorious figure was gone. But dig deeper in the story phrase. That's what grabbed Ohler's attention. The account hinges on second-hand Soviet reports and German witnesses, either fanatically loyal or terrified for their lives. No public autopsy. No universally accepted remains. The Soviets, who claimed to find the bodies, withheld physical evidence. For years, and they finally produced something, a skull fragment, and teeth historians raised doubts. In 2009, American researchers tested the skull and found it belonged to a woman under 40. Maybe Eva Braun, but definitely not Hitler. So what happened? Ohler doesn't pretend to know, but he dares to ask why we've settled for such a murky version of the truth. This is the most consequential death of the 20th century, told Rogan. Yet it's backed by the flimsiest evidence. It's a gut punch observation. The man behind millions of deaths, the face of evil, and we don't have a body. The story rests on statements from Hitler's inner circle as valet, secretaries, SS guards, grilled by Soviet forces under duress. Their accounts clashed. One said Hitler collapsed after the shot. Another claimed he was already dead. Some said the bodies were fully burned. Others said partially. Then there's Stalin, who publicly insisted Hitler escaped. Was it propaganda to keep the Allies off balance? Maybe, but why sow doubt unless doubt already existed? The bunker was sealed, later demolished. The crime scene vanished. Evidence scattered. Ohler's point isn't to push a conspiracy, but to question why historians settled for so little. War crime trials like Nuremberg demanded airtight proof, yet Hitler's fate rests on shaky testimony and Soviet-held fragments that surfaced. Decades later, it's tempting to stick with the familiar story because it's what we've always known. But Ohler challenges that. If this story holds, prove it beyond doubt. If it doesn't, why haven't we looked harder? The world needed a story, not necessarily the truth, told Joe. For Rogan's audience, that landed like a thunderbolt. The idea that the pivotal death of modern history might be too tidy, too unscrutinized, was staggering. By the time Ohler and Rogan pivoted to South America, the conversation had shifted from bunker discrepancies to something darker. The Ratlins. These secret escape routes funneled dozens, maybe hundreds, of Nazi officials out of Europe after World War II. Some slipped through with help from sympathetic clergy. Others with forged papers, landing in Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, or Brazil. High-profile Nazis, like Adolf Eichmann, the Holocaust's architect, were nabbed in Buenos Aires years later. Joseph Mengele, Auschwitz's angel of death, lived freely in South America for decades. If they could vanish, why not Hitler? That's what Ohler pressed. He wasn't saying Hitler definitely escaped. He was saying the infrastructure existed. For someone as powerful as Hitler, it was plausible. Then Ohler dropped a bombshell. Declassified FBI. Memos from the 1940s and 1950s, U.S. agents investigated. Hitler sightings years after the war, some vague, others eerily detailed. One described a man resembling Hitler in an Argentine-German enclave, guarded heavily. Another, marked reliable, was dropped for lack of concrete proof. Joe's eyes widened. If they were sure he was dead, why were they chasing leads? In the 50s, it was a sharp question. The Allies weren't fully convinced. British intelligence suspected Stalin was hiding something. The Soviets fueled rumors of Hitler's escape, maybe to sow discord, maybe because they weren't sure. Ohler shared stories from his interviews in Argentina locales, recalling mysterious Germans settling in remote areas in the 1950s. No names. No photos, but consistent whispers of someone powerful. One town spoke of a jungle house where outsiders weren't welcome.
Ohler
Didn't claim these were facts, but they formed a pattern. The U.S. kept searching, listening, watching. The dots weren't wild speculation, they were real escapes, real documents, real questions. Could Hitler have used the same pipeline as Eichmann, with his resources and loyalists? Could he have slipped away as Berlin burned? I'm not saying. He lived in Argentina, Ohler said. I'm saying the possibility was never fully ruled out.
for Rogan's audience.
It wasn't a conspiracy. It was a historical gap that refuses to close. Ohler didn't just pore over archives, he walked the paths himself. His investigations took him to Argentina, Chile, and remote Andean villages where history lingers in hushed tones. When Rogan asked what drove him, Ohler was clear. It's not about proving a conspiracy. It's about chasing a question dismissed too easily. Patagonia, he met Esteban,